We're getting to know each other very well over the next few hours as I will be taking over emceeing responsibilities from David, who we should congratulate on his terrific job so far. And as I heard Stephanie expressing serious props to the folks sitting in the front here, this is courageous and noble what you're doing, so much respect. This panel, in addition to taking us to 11, is about to go extraordinarily deep because we're about to get into time, which in our new interplanetary view has to be a central concept for us to consider. What is time? How do we think about the scale of time when we're dealing with the entire universe? When we're not just living on our planet, but potentially other planets? How do we think about the scale of our own lives and our temporal existences? And with new technologies, how do we manage our lifespans? What should our goals be in this respect? How do we think about generations? And with us, we have three extraordinary folks. And Michael here, along the way, Michael Garfield is going to be doing generative scribing. So that will represent the artistic component of this panel. But let me introduce the panelists to you first. Martine, who I have thankfully just spent some extraordinary time with, is a magical, mystical person whose written bio, which I won't read in full, begins with the best sentence I've ever seen in a bio. Martine cultivates invisible parts of reality, which is extraordinarily trippy. And her career began with Sirius XM, cultivating the electromagnetic spectrum. And since she's done a number of remarkable things, but as you can learn about at the compartment over here, United Therapeutics has become her vocation, developing therapeutic treatments for people with diseases that have gone ignored for too long, and thankfully that when addressed represent both great humanitarian opportunities and also commercial opportunities. Stephanie is at the Human Environment Dynamics Laboratory at Pennsylvania State University. And her work looks to the past to give us a grounding in the way we think about the future, using all sorts of dynamic simulations, agent-based modeling, and other fancy techniques that I don't understand. Stephanie is trying to understand whether the patterns of history, and correct me if I'm wrong once you start talking, can give us any sense of what's to come and can allow us to make predictions about the processes that we're currently a part of. And Van Savage, arguably the best name on the panel and in the universe, is at UCLA but has deep roots at the Santa Fe Institute. And Van is a theoretical physicist studying quantum gravity, but ultimately, he has branched into areas as exotic as the biology of circulation in humans and lifespan and what biological time means. Yeah?
Yeah, all right.
So I've just given you a small sense of what's to come, and with that, please welcome our panel. One last note. After the panel, Martine is going to be signing copies of her book right over there. So get a copy and get a signature.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So as DA said, actually, the nice introduction, I sort of started off in physics and then switched to biology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of time from a very broad perspective, what time is, how we measure it, and then how that translates into physics and biology and how we have to think about clocks coordinate. And I think that will lead into the questions about civilizations and cities that our other panelists will talk about. So I'll talk for a little bit and then turn it over and sequence the rest. And then we'll take questions at the end. But yeah, my background was originally in theoretical physics doing charge parity time symmetry, so time reversal. So I thought a lot about what time meant. So a question you can start off with is just how do we define time in physics? One way is just the sequence of events, that I had to walk up on this stage before I could talk to you. Or if I hit another car in the intersection, it had to get there first before I did. So certain events had to happen in an order. So that defines time. Or also, I think we'll hear more about later, this idea that according to the laws of physics, disorder increases in time. So things become more disordered and random in time. So if you watch disorder increasing, that's a marker of time. Of course, that's not something we can easily measure if we want to talk to each other about where we meet at 3 o'clock or meet tonight at 10 o'clock to have a drink. So when we talk about time in our everyday lives, we usually mean clocks. So what about clocks too? And over the course of human history, how we develop our definitions of time and thinking about time started with very basic astronomical and seasonal facts, right? Like a year is how long it takes to go around the sun. A month is related to the phases of the moon. A day is related to a revolution of the earth. And in time, we got more and more sophisticated to think about things like now the current definition of a second is how many decays there are of a cesium atom, or actually transitions the energy levels of a cesium atom. And so that's sort of our definitions of times and of clocks. And coordinating clocks is one theme I want to come back to, and the other panelists will too, is that coordinating clocks is a non-trivial thing to do and is very important for getting things right. And that's we see in our everyday life. Like when train systems were built, we had to coordinate clocks for different trains to make sure that trains arrived and left when they were supposed to in ways that communicated with other cities. And now, in terms of timing, if we want to have an application for something due at 5 p.m., my computer time better be the same as your computer time or my phone time. Or for financial transactions, I can make money if I actually can have a clock that goes at a different rate than someone else's. Or if clocks are mismatched and things get set at different rates, I can actually make money off of that. And there are financial companies that actually pay to have huge lines built to increase the speeds of their transactions and take advantage of clock mismatches. And that's a case where we all sort of agree on our clock, right? We're all on Earth, and we all agree about what time is and what our clock is. But to tie this back to interplanetary thinking in terms of colonization or communication or travel to other planets, I would argue these problems become much, much more complex and much, much more sophisticated. So for example, if we think about going, in the most trivial sense, to another planet, our definition of a day or a year will change, right? Because it may take us longer to get around the sun, or there could be 2 suns, or we could rotate much faster or much slower. But we also need to worry about things. You might say, well, okay, sure, but I can still put a clock there and have a clock here on Earth. And if the clocks are set by the same time standard, I'll still measure the same time. If I talk to them on another planet, I can have the same time scale going. But even that's not really true, particularly like Einstein's theory of relativity. His whole point is that how fast the clock ticks, how fast that second hand ticks, depends on how fast things travel. The faster you're going, the faster the speed, the slower that clock ticks, actually. And then the limit that you go as fast as light, the clock stops ticking altogether. Light, in terms of Einstein's relativity, doesn't experience time at all. So I hear this question sometimes, does time exist? My answer often is it does exist because time doesn't experience it. Light doesn't experience it, so it knows where the absence of time is. So that's one way, is that even our clock, even if we set a clock here on Earth and take it to another planet, it may tick at a very different rate on another planet. But you say, well, why do we care about that? Well, I'm going to argue biologically, if we think about interfacing or colonizing or having other planets and systems. We heard earlier about autonomous ecosystems. If we want to have other species and other organisms and other planets, we each, even if we don't have a watch, carry around lots of little clocks inside of us, which is sort of like, when should we sleep? How fast do we grow from birth to adult? How fast do we age? We have clocks going around in our bodies all the time that we're just not conscious of. And if we go to another planet, because of the daylight cycle or because of the temperature, or for different reasons, those clocks may be reset. And if we think about having a complex ecosystem with fish or birds or mammals or lizards or reptiles, some of those things, if you change temperature, like lizards, reptiles, and fish, their clock changes essentially. They age faster, they grow faster, they do everything faster at higher temperatures, whereas we don't. So we're sort of decoupling clocks. We're changing clocks of some organisms, but not of others. So it's not even one single biological clock. You have lots of biological clocks. And even for mammals, if we have a constant temperature, a mouse has a very different clock than an elephant. Its heart beats much faster, it ages much faster, it gets cancer much faster. So thinking about the interplay between all these species we need to coexist, or predator-prey interactions and what eats what, and how that might change in a different planet with different temperature, different daylight cycle, is really a complicated endeavor to think, how do we couple these biological clocks? How do we couple those biological clocks with physical clocks for trains? And then that also leads into not just physical clocks and biological clocks, but things like clocks for civilization or cities. And thinking about sort of city clocks, some work done at Santa Fe Institute by Jeffrey West and Louis Bettencourt and several people shows the larger the city, sort of the faster the clock ticks as well. That people tend to walk faster in larger cities, do things at a faster rate in larger cities, feel more time pressured in larger cities. So even our clock across the country can vary depending on what city we're in. I mean, not the clock we measure on our phone, but the clock for what we think we need to do a series of events in. And that relates to not just us getting around every day, but also timescales for like civilization advances, making travel to other planets. And I can say I always thought I was kind of immune to those city clocks because I sort of would stay up all night and sleep all day. But now that I have a child and a wife and a job that I have to go to more regularly, once you're coupled, that's the whole thing about coupling, is once you have to integrate with lots of other people and lots of other schedules, you can't get away from that, and those other clocks really matter to you. And I promised David I'd talk a little bit about quantum physics, and that'll tie into other things as well, which is has to do with our perception of time. These are just, what I've talked so far is about really coupling time scales or clocks in ways that allow us to coexist with species and be able to eat them and survive, have a daylight cycle that works for us. But also these questions, to be able to think about these, it matters how we perceive time to begin with. And we'll hear more about this from other panelists as well. But even in physics, there's very different ideas for how to perceive time, even in quantum physics. I mean, one of the ideas out there is this idea of a multiverse, that every time in quantum mechanics you have a choice, that you have or not even a choice, that say one electron could be spinning up and one could be spinning down, and that translates up to all the possible things that could happen in the universe and all the possible branches and choices we make, that actually every time that happens, we branch into different universes. And we actually have this ever-expanding branching of multiple universes. And if there was a way to travel back and forth between these universes, it would change our perception of time and change our perception of space, because the sequence of events that had happened in each universe would be very different. And also one final thought before I turn it over, is that we often hear about one of the things that separates time from space. Space, we can walk forward, backward, left, right, up, and down. Time, we tend to be able to only go forward. We can't go backward. We often wish we could, but we can't do it. But the other question I always ask is not only why do we go forward, but why can't we have multiple time dimensions? Why do we only go, is forward and backward our only question? Why can't we go left to right and up and down? And why can't we circle around in time in different ways? And in physics, it's not disallowed. It creates all kinds of complications. But it's not impossible. You can have 10 spatial dimensions, 11 spatial dimensions. You could have a principle have extra time dimensions, and that adds even more complications. Think about how we couple time clocks, how that might work as we travel to other planets and talk to other civilizations. And I think we'll hear about those ideas from some other panelists as well. So I think I've talked enough at least to start. I can circle back later and take questions, but I think Stephanie should go next. Dr. Stephanie Crabtree.
Hi. That's great. Time is an interesting question for archaeologists because we spend so much time thinking about the past. And I think that, in all honesty, archaeology can save the world. So we're all dealing with some pretty big challenges now, but we can look back into the deep time and see other civilizations that have lived through similar challenges. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons why bringing in archaeology to talk about these questions of time, to talk about interplanetary health, is important. Because we can look at the trajectories of civilizations, the ways they experience their lifetimes as individuals and as societies, and look at the different challenges that they faced, and the ways that they confronted them. So some of the ways that I approach looking at the archaeological record are through computer modeling. So I also dig in the dirt. But I spend a fair amount of time building simulations, network simulations, and kind of SimCity style simulations, agent-based models, where we can build these worlds that experience time and run them hundreds of thousands of times to look at what happened in these societies. And it's an interesting way to be able to have a time machine, essentially, to build these simulations based on things that we know about archaeological societies. Running back around to this idea of time and how societies experience time, we now think about time in kind of a linear way, right? My birthday is the end of June, and so I'm going to mark the fact that I will be a year older. We are experiencing 2018 right now. Next year will be 2019. We look at it in a linear manner. But a lot of societies, as archaeologists, we think experienced more of a cyclical style time, where you're dependent on the seasons, where instead of looking at the clock moving forward and the calendar moving forward, we are looking forward to another spring, and we're resetting the clock every time. Or if we look at Mayan civilizations, we know that they had a 400-year-ish cycle for their calendar. And so there are different ways that we can experience time, as Van brought up, that we need to, as a society, understand our own internal time, understand the ways that we all experience time and relate it to each other, the ways that this relates to how our society is progressing and how we're interacting with the Earth and with other things that we interact with. And these will be challenges that we're going to face if and when we do end up going out into the stars and establishing colonies out there. So I think they're all very interesting questions. You don't have to clap. We're having a conversation.
And then Martin?
Stephanie and Ben, I would like to talk about time from the...
So here, okay.
Can't hear me?
Maybe I think, yeah, move it up. Yeah, there you go. That place.
I'd like to...
Let me try. Can I try to bend? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Or maybe better? Try?
Hello?
Let me try one more time. Sorry. I don't know. I'm not getting it right. Yeah, maybe that's... Oh, there you go.
Hello?
How about we do this for now?
Oh, yeah.
Experiencing the time delay of microphones.
Thank you, Stephanie. That's a good idea.
Hello? How's that? Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Now I can clap. Yes, in the nick of time. So I'd like to talk about time a little bit at the same time as mentioning three people who have influenced my thinking on this subject. Erwin Schrödinger, Ray Kurzweil, and Gerard K. O'Neill, and talk about time a little bit from the standpoint of physics, a little bit from the standpoint of human perception, and a bit from what I do in my day job, which is technology development. So I think of time physically as something which, as Van mentioned, represents an increase in entropy. And people say that ultimately, if the universe completely ran down according to the second law of thermodynamics, we'd be in a state of maximum entropy, and we would reach kind of an end of time when nothing changed anymore. It's also quite interesting that we live in a very complex environment, and there are many different types of entropic processes going on at all times. And depending on which parts of our environment we focus on, we see more entropic processes going on, more positive entropy, more things running down, or other parts of our environment we may not pay any attention to, and we don't see the entropy in those parts of the environment. So time may run differently for different observers, as Van pointed out in his talk. Now, when I moved my own career from electrical engineering to biology, my favorite book was a book entitled What is Life?, written by somebody who was anything but a biologist. He was Erwin Schrödinger, one of the greatest physicists of the last century. And in this little book, What is Life?, which you can always find on Amazon, and it's very small, not even 60 or 70 pages, I don't think, Schrödinger comes up with a different definition of life than any biologist had ever come up with. Schrödinger said what life is a process of negative entropy, of instead of things becoming more disordered, of things becoming more ordered, pursuant to a code, a reproducible, or in his words, a periodic code. For example, DNA is such a code. And instead of us becoming more disordered from the time we form as zygotes, we in fact become more and more ordered. And so he looked at life as something that went, for a period of time, quite contrary to the direction of the second law of thermodynamics. Now, this idea of a code, in my mind, was absolutely beautiful, and I locked onto it because it seemed to be the pathway to solving a lot of diseases, as D.A. mentioned in the beginning, is what my day job is all about. And in the course of solving these diseases, I came across another wonderful book written by another individual who had not a bit of training in the life sciences, Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil wrote a book, The Singularity is Near, The Age of Spiritual Machines. And in all of these books, he puts forward the notion that we are gradually compounding in our code computation. Our codes are gradually becoming more and more sophisticated, able to compute and decode greater and greater amounts of entropy. And at the current rate of exponential growth in computation and information processing, in just a few decades' time, certainly in just a few centuries of time, we will have a computational capability equal to that of all of the atoms in the entire known universe. And so Ray Kurzweil posits that the universe will not end in a cold, end-of-time, total state of entropy, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, nor will the universe end in a big crush, massive gravitational, heat-oriented crush, but instead our growing intelligence from this compounding of knowledge and information processing will allow us to discern new laws of physics that are not currently understood today, laws of physics and layers of nature that more deeply underlie physics today, just as our physics of today more deeply underlies reality than did Newtonian physics. And so in Ray's view, we will very likely end up streaming order back into this universe from some other universes in the multiverse that Van referred to previously to enable an infinite extension of biology in this universe. Now that finally, to me, links with my first mentor coming out of college, and in fact the main reason why I feel so excited to be here at the first annual Interplanetary Festival today. And that individual is Gerard K. O'Neill, who propounded the idea in the 1970s and 1980s that the natural place for an expanding industrial civilization, the type of Kurzweilian civilization that would be building Dyson spheres and things like this, is not on the surface of a planet, but is instead out in the cosmos. That we should have a cosmic consciousness and living out in the cosmos, and within just a few decades' time, there would in fact be more humans living off the Earth in space habitats at like Lagrange stable gravitational points between the Earth and Moon, known as L4 and L5. I found this idea absolutely inspiring, completely logical, and have been devoting my life to it ever since. And I'm so glad to see that the Santa Fe Institute is bringing all of its great intelligence and its insight into reality to help serve as kind of like the key enzyme to push human civilization out off the planet and into the cosmos. Now, as Jerry O'Neill reached the end of his life, he began to grapple with just how long would it take to move us all interplanetary. And he wrote a book called 2081, An Optimistic View for the Human Future, which of course envisions the world in 2081 in which there would be more people living off planet than on planet, many of them in these vast habitats, Bernal spheres around the L4 and L5 Lagrange points. And O'Neill grappled with a simple question. He sat there and he spent something like 5 years reading every science fiction book he could read, every scientific forecast he could read from the expert forecasters throughout the 20th century. And he said, why are people almost always wrong about what next technology is going to be available in 10 years or 20 years? And why are people almost always wrong with how soon the technologies will come that they think won't be here for 100 years or 200 years? And as an example, he said, where is the flying car? Since the Jetsons in the 60s, we've been waiting for the flying car. We were wrong. It wasn't around the corner. On the other hand, if you take a look at the most far-sighted science fiction writers in the 20th century, the Robert Heinleins, the Arthur C. Clarkes, none of them saw that billions of human beings in just a few decades would have in the palm of their hand the knowledge of the entire world, and essentially for free. So this was something, everybody having the knowledge in the palm of your hand, this was something that would occur distantly in the third millennium, 2200s, 2300s, Star Trek days. No, it came around in 2005. So why this difference in perception? I think the solution of this lies in the idea that Van and Stephanie identified previously, that we humans have a big effect on the actual passage of time, that it is a function of perception, that when we build more order into the world, in the Schrödinger sense, we actually pull the future forward to us. When we build more order, we pull.
I think that might be our time, actually.
Yeah, I think we're almost out of time anyway. But if you want to
Okay,
say
well, we
yeah.
pull the future forward with our own activities. So all of you being here at this Interplanetary Festival, you are help creating time, not using time, and bringing the best of times forward to today.
Thank you.
I just want to say one last thought with that idea, though, Martine, is that humans are nothing if not inventive. And one of the things we can look back at the past 200,000 years of Homo sapiens sapiens is look at how we can imagine our futures. And I think that that is exactly what's happening. We look archaeologically, we can see people imagining their futures and bringing future to them. And that's what we're doing here today. And so we need to be more imaginative and think about time and our ability to change it.
Okay. And then do we have time for questions from the yeah? Should we take a couple of questions from the audience before we go? Yeah. Okay. Is there a mic to take around, or if you say it, I can hear you. I can repeat it too. Okay.
I don't know that there's a microphone anymore. I think it's oh.
Here, he's got one.
We can hear you. You're good.
You're good.
Hello. Oh, okay. Well, let me introduce myself. My name is Boris the Bluebeard, and I'm a nuclear engineer, used to be a nuclear engineer, working in CERN. and I'm an artist, diplomat, warrior, and a lot of other things. And I speak 15 languages, and I've been in 38 countries. But now I'm very excited to be familiar with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And my first question is why he's not here to give us some laughter about and look at human beings. The difference between chimpanzee and us is just 1%, DNA. So you said we know too much, but I don't think we know too much at all. This is what he said. Just imagine that another sort of species, they can be anybody from any kind of multiverse. They can consider us like out of line with everything. So they can say, okay, you know about astrophysicists, you heard about Neil deGrasse Tyson. The question is this: how far we can go in a future to expect in our lifespan? We can expect too much, but how far we can go to Mars?
To Mars?
I'm ready to go. Just let's do the math and
To go or to live there?
to be there and stay for a while.
So I think, I'll start answering that, but then everyone else should answer too. So I think to go is very feasible, actually. I mean, not easy, but I think that's definitely within our reach. But it's a much harder question of how we could go and live there and stay there. And that's actually next to these questions we're talking about how could you have all the things that you need there to live? How could you have the right time scales? One thing we didn't talk about, but Stephanie did beforehand, is in some sense our planet is changing. Climate change is changing our planet to a different planet. And you already see problems with time scales of insects or plants coming out at the wrong time. Things don't eat them. Species can't coexist. So we need to solve those problems in some sense in the same way we need to think about how we could have life on Mars. But yeah.
And those challenges of figuring out those syncing cycles are things that our ancestors have done in the past, but we're going to have to figure out as we go into the future. If we do colonize Mars, are the plants that we grow, are they going to grow? Is corn going to be 120 frost-free days like we have here, or is it going to be something different because it adapts to the ecosystem that we build there? And so these are challenges that we have to adapt toward, why we need models that are built on the past, and why we need to be flexible into the future.
Do you want? Agree. Okay. Okay. All right.